Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I'd like to welcome those who are watching us live streaming from Crookston, from the University of Minnesota Morris, from Rochester, and from Duluth. And we had some wonderful conversations yesterday and dialogue with folks from Duluth who were here on campus and University of Minnesota Morris, and we also learned a lot about what great things are going on at Crookston and Rochester. Really excited to have people here today in the house from the Twin Cities, from Rochester, and from the University of Minnesota Morris. So welcome to everyone. Please know also that today's bystander training and tomorrow's social norms training are going to be filmed, and that those will be available to use on all of our system campuses, and that yesterday's talk with Alan Berkowitz, who will be joining us in just a second again, is also available for you to use. And people talked yesterday about maybe using part of Alan's talk that's filmed and then stopping the tape, having deeper conversations, and then moving forward. His slides are also available, so we'll make those available to everybody on campus. So just wanted you to know that. My name's Karen Miksch. I should have started maybe there. I use she, her, hers as my pronouns. And I'm here on the Twin Cities campus. I'm a faculty member of higher education and law in the College of Education and Human Development. And I'm here today as well as the co-chair of the Twin Cities President's Initiative to Prevent Sexual Misconduct. I co-chair the committee along with Dean John Finnegan in Public Health. And I'm very excited to be here today. I'm very excited to participate again in a bystander intervention training. I think that whether you've been through one of these trainings before or not, this is going to be a great opportunity for us to learn more and how to think about how to contextualize this work on a variety of campus situations. And we will very quickly, in like 1 minute, be starting our session, and Alan's going to walk us through how this is going to work today as well. But before he takes over, I just wanted to introduce him. For those of us who were here yesterday, we got to have a lot of conversation and dialogue, and I think that was really helpful. For those of you who haven't had a chance to meet Alan Berkowitz yet, he is a national and internationally recognized expert on bystander intervention and prevention. And so the real emphasis today is on prevention efforts on our campuses and how bystander intervention can help us to promote prevention and healthy campus climates. Tomorrow we'll also be looking at social norms training, and if you can't be here for that, that'll also be filmed, so you'll have access to those as well. So I don't want to take up a lot of our time, but I do want to say again, thank you to everybody for all of the work that you're doing. Thank you for being here today. I look forward to some great dialogue and conversations, and please welcome Alan Berkowitz.
Good morning. We'll also say hello to the people who are watching this after it has already happened. And in that case, we will either say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or who knows, maybe even good night, right? So I've agreed to be pinned down behind the lectern, which is not my style for the sake of the videotaping, which is fine. I want to first say that what is happening in the University of Minnesota system around this issue is very unusual, and if you have any institutional pride, which I didn't for any of the institutions I went to, but if you do, you can feel proud. And even if you don't have institutional pride, you could feel good that something important and valuable is happening that we also believe will be personally valuable to you. Because dealing with this issue of sexual harassment and sexual assault, which is now in our face, you know, in the media, is about really changing culture. Because the culture's like the soil, and the plant grows in the soil, and the composition of the soil, I'm not an agronomist, but I went to a land-grant college, right? So the composition of the soil determines what can grow in it and what grows well and what doesn't grow well. And the culture, unfortunately, lets things grow that aren't good. You know, and it's not only sexual harassment and sexual assault, of course. And we're all part of the culture. So that means it either happens to us it happens to someone we care about. Maybe we perpetrate it consciously or unconsciously, and maybe we witness it. So it's really very personal. I'm going to talk about the theory and the research on bystander behavior because I think we need to know, let's say, the state of knowledge around this issue. And it's really becoming a hot topic. If you want to read the literature now, you're getting flooded because it's like the flavor of the month is to do research on bystander intervention. But I think what's really important is as human beings, we're faced every day with uncomfortable situations that we don't know how to handle because they bother us. Maybe somebody says or does something that doesn't feel right to us and we don't know how to respond. And so that's what we call as a bystander, is someone who stands by. And it not only results in you're not addressing a situation or allowing it to continue, but it doesn't feel good inside. So whatever you want to call that part of yourself that it doesn't feel good to, it isn't good for us either to be bystanders. Because we have to live with ourselves, and we don't feel good living with something that doesn't feel right, where we didn't act in the way we wanted. So in some way this is very personal. It's not only, let's say, academic. And we're going to rearrange how we do it a little bit because there's going to be time for practice and intervention skills, and I'm going to do some role plays. And at the end, I'm going to give you review different ways of intervening or responding, because it's important that everyone feel that there's something they could do in a particular situation that's comfortable. And no one can dictate to you how you should react, because when you take into account all the variables and what we call intersectionality, which is differences in power, differences in gender identity, differences in ethnicity, blah, 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 all those things, no one can really say, you should have done this in this situation. But you might say to yourself, I wish I had done something in this situation. So our responsibility is to give you enough choices that you will do something that you feel okay that you did something, without us saying you should have done X. So the latter part of the workshop is going to be practice, and we're going to actually break into small groups, and you're going to practice with each other. And so because we're filming this, what we're going to do is I'm going to describe that section of the workshop at the end, and then we're going to go through it. We're not going to do it. We're going to go past it and close the training from the point of view of the filming, and then we'll reopen it up in this room and we'll do the practicing together. Because we don't need to film that or keep folks waiting. And then the folks who are not either here now at this time or in this place, they will still have a chance to try to practice themselves. So that seems to be the best way to handle it. And as was said in the introduction, I really appreciate feedback and interaction and questions and comments because it's for you. It's for me too, but in a different way. So even though you could go home and live stream it, I hope that a lot of you will come back tomorrow because I would like to have you here. Okay. And I've been talking a lot about bystander intervention and the social norms approach as two best practices, two science-based best practices. So we're going to have really a good chunk of time this morning and tomorrow to go deep into each of them, and then for you all to see how you want to use those approaches in this system, right, as you address this issue. And you'll see that it's applicable to everything else, right? I mean, you can be a bystander to racism, homophobia, Islamophobia, anything that, let's say, is unjust. You can respond in what we call as an active bystander, not as a passive bystander. So we're just going to define the terminology a little and review the research and theory. I want to talk about the intersection between the norms approach and the bystander approach, because whether or not people intervene is very heavily determined by whether or not they think other people are also concerned, and whether or not they think other people will support or respect them if they intervene. And very often we don't know the truth about each other. So if we don't give each other correct information, that as a man, I would say, I don't like men bragging about their sexual exploits. That offends me. I've always got a bad stomach from that my whole life. But when I was younger, I wouldn't say anything because I thought the other guys were into it, hearing it. And now, because I get to study this, I know that I was a silent majority. And if I had known that other men felt the way I would have spoken up. So that's very common in different bystander scenarios, that we don't know how other people in this situation are feeling. And that's very important information that we need to have. So part of the challenge as you address this issue of sexual harassment and sexual assault here on this campus and in this system is to give people correct information about each other that will empower them to act in respectful, healthy, and safe ways rather than do nothing. So I want to talk about some of the campaigns that are being done. There'll be a little overlap from yesterday and with tomorrow. And then I want to do the skills and practice. And as I said, before the break, we're going to have you write on a piece of paper an offensive remark that you heard that bothered you while you were on this campus at some point that you didn't know how to respond to. And then over the break, I'll choose some of those remarks to do some role plays with, to show you different ways you could respond using different skills, so that hopefully everyone feels there's some way that they personally could respond, taking into account all the variables. Next steps, and one of my themes that I might be boring with you by now is that we really need to use these two approaches together. And in my opinion, they can be unifying paradigms because they apply to everything, that there's bystanders in every situation and there's misperceptions of the norms in every situation. And we could talk about many other issues, and we could use these two approaches to understand and address these issues. So what's the greatest asset of this community or this system or all the campuses is that most people care and want to do what's right. Most people, when they see injustice, they want to do something. Most people, when they see that someone needs help, they want to do something. Now, we don't always do it. That's the problem. And the reasons we don't always do it are not always comfortable to me anyway. Like, for instance, white people are more likely to intervene as a bystander with another white person and not as a person of color. Or with your friends. So even though we want to do what's right, it's not like we're angels, right? We have all this stuff inside that jams us up and we don't follow through on the impulse. But it's important to start with the fact that most people have the good impulse. And if we want to bring out social change, we need to give permission for the good impulse to express itself, and in some cases we could say be re-educated, right? Because I want to be able to intervene in any situation where anyone needs my help, that I could make a difference independently of any of their identities. But there's things inside of me that might make me hesitate, so I have to do some internal cleaning to be myself, which we all have to do. But we want to start with the good, because we don't want to lecture people and say, you all need to change your attitudes, and that doesn't work. And it's not true. Most people are uncomfortable with unwanted behaviors and social injustice. Now, once again, it's relative, because as a person who doesn't have other identities, I don't know what it's like to be a person of color or live in a female body, right? Or have a sexual orientation that isn't widely accepted in the outside world. So I may notice injustice, but I might not notice a lot of other injustice. It's like missing my radar. So the thing we want to acknowledge is, if you want to help me be an effective bystander, we start with the injustice I already noticed that I feel uncomfortable with. And we empower me to act on that injustice. And then over time, I'll start seeing more and more, now I see racism everywhere, even though it isn't coming on to me, because I've learned to notice it. I'll tell you a quick story. People like stories. I was in the elevator with an African-American colleague. We were at a conference, and we were rooming together. So I'm kind of sociable. I can be extroverted when I need to be. So we're in the elevator, and we're having our name tags, and other people are with their name tags from another conference. So I said, "Oh, what conference are you here for?" And I started schmoozing with some people in the elevator who were strangers. And my African-American friend enters the conversation. And the white woman I'm talking to doesn't even look at him. She just keeps talking to me as if he didn't exist. Now, I have to confess that for narcissistic reasons, I didn't notice. Because I was getting the attention. But he was, I don't know what you want to, brave enough, courageous enough, whatever. He was able to say, excuse me, why aren't you talking to me? And his ability to do that made me see something that I didn't see. So now, thanks to the help of many beautiful people who have been willing to share with me their experience, I see all the stuff that I never saw. And then, of course, I have to do something because I want to do something. So we all have a lot to do, right? The more we see, the more we have to do. So we're assuming that even though we don't see all injustice, or maybe in some cases we might contribute to some injustice, the way to teach people to not be bystanders is to start with the injustice that they see and feel comfortable with and want to do something. That's the pedagogy. And then it like grows from there. Rather than to lecture people about what they don't see and that they should see it, etc. Does that make sense? People who do like social justice education find that this is very liberating because they can dive right into the fact that people see stuff that they don't like and they want to do something about it. And then later, you can bring in more information that will expand our horizons about what we need to intervene against. So the goal is to focus on the positive in order to transform the negative and to help individuals, I like to say, act from the heart. And the science shows that focusing on the positive is more effective prevention strategy than focusing on the negative. The research is very clear. So it isn't that we don't acknowledge a negative, otherwise we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't have anything to talk about, but we do have a lot to talk about. So the idea is we focus on the positive as a way of growing the positive and shrinking the negative. It could be like changing the soil composition. Right? We start adding the ingredients of what we want to grow, and we remove the ingredients of what we don't want to grow, but we start by appreciating those ingredients that are already there that we like for our purposes, rather than make them feel neglected. So then they won't want to feed the plants, right? Okay. So we use the word passive bystander for someone who doesn't do anything, and an active bystander for someone who does. And the idea is that the bystander can create a climate that inhibits negative behavior. And those of you that heard my talk yesterday, we know that the men who commit the majority of sexual assaults, 5% of men commit 95% of sexual assaults, including sexual assaults experienced by women who are currently in same-sex relationships. So independently of how we want to talk about gender, sexual assaults are committed by male-identified individuals who are very committed to their male identity, who perpetrate a lot of assaults. And those people are not going to, let's say, voluntarily change. They don't think they're doing anything wrong. If you talk to them, they're going to find ways to blame the victim. So what's going to stop them is the rest of us. What's going to stop them is for us to intervene. And it's very common, and you have had examples of this on this campus, because you're not, even though you're unusual, you're not totally unusual. So let's say I'm a department chair or I'm on the faculty, and I get busted for sexual harassment. And you think, well, I'm not surprised that Alan Berkowitz got busted. Why not? Why weren't you surprised? What have you been seeing me do for 10 years that made you not surprised when I got busted? Well, that means you've been a bystander. And I'm not saying this to make anyone feel guilty, because we're all bystanders, including me. I'm saying this for us to realize that there's so many things we could have done if we had had the training and the skills that we weren't given. And that next time we can do something, and maybe I'll leave her after 2 years, or maybe I'll get busted after 2 years, or maybe I'll be in the 5% of perpetrators that can clean up his act. I'm going to say he, because I need to be fair to reality. And even though women can offend, and women can abuse, and women can sexually harass, the overwhelming majority of sexual harassment and sexual assault is perpetrated by males against females. So even if you don't believe in the gender binary, the behavior takes place within people who believe in the gender binary. So I'm going to use he for the perpetrator and she for the victim in most cases. But I will obviously acknowledge that that isn't all cases. But just to let you know why I'm choosing the language I'm choosing, because I believe that a lot of our assumptions about gender are incorrect, and we especially need to use gender-neutral language, but we shouldn't use gender-neutral language when it obscures the truth about something. You know, and sometimes when you're working with men, they'll say, well, women can assault men, and I would say that's true. But it turns out that 99% of the assaults are men against women, so that's why we're here, because we're the ones that could do something about it. So you have to work with, there's challenges inside the issue that we have to work around. So people want to do something but don't. So how do we overcome our inhibitions? And that's the skills piece. The social norms piece is most people underestimate other people's concern. And there's very strong, good research on this now that people don't know that other people are also concerned about X. Or people don't know, I don't know that you would respect me if I said something. And because I care about you and want you to respect me, if I think, you know, like in guy language we'll say, you're ruining his chances, or the old crude word, you know, you're blocking part of his body. Right? So if I'm afraid that I'll be disapproved by intervening, I'm less likely to intervene. But if I would receive approval for intervening, everyone wants, I want to know, you all want me to know that, so I'll do something. And as I was saying, it's possible to create a culture in which individuals feel encouraged and supported to express concern and intervene, so that's what we're trying to do here and in this system, and that's going to take time. Fortunately, this institution has a president who's really committed to this and who's not looking for a quick fix. Because a lot of people, they don't have the patience to get into it for the long haul, and they want to see some results quickly because they don't want to get bad publicity. We know all the reasons, but in the end we don't solve anything. So we want to create long-term effort to change the culture of this institution so that over time people are more and more likely to intervene, and people who perpetrate, including verbally unacceptable behaviors, are less likely to engage in them. So that's what we want to try and understand today and tomorrow, is how correcting misperceptions of bystanders intervention inhibits perpetrators and encourages people to intervene, and then give you all and everyone the skills to intervene. Now, the other thing that makes this complicated, obviously, is we all exist in different realities. So if I'm a graduate student or a postdoc and my advisor or employer is harassing me, it's a very different reality than if I'm going out to dinner with a bunch of my friends and someone who's my equal says something that I don't like. So when you this is where there isn't enough discussion of how the idea of intersectionality lays onto the whole issue of bystander behavior and creates different kinds of situations that make it difficult for people to respond in different ways. So when we do that, we need to give people a lot of options. So I'm going to talk a lot about indirect intervention, which is not confronting the thing, but still interrupting. And some people say that that's a cop-out. I don't think so. It's you're doing something that you wouldn't have done, taking into account the realities of your situation, which some people it is not wise to confront because they may make decisions about your life, unless you're willing to accept the consequences. Okay, so it's not only sexual assault and sexual harassment. We could talk about alcohol-related harm, other forms of injustice, inappropriate remarks, victim blaming. We could talk about academic dishonesty, right? When I know that somebody's cheating on a paper. You know, I know that some group on campus has a file of old term papers, and people could use those. I mean, there's many ways that we could apply this. So I want to just do a little exercise and you can, and then later we'll write something down. But now I want you to turn to the person next to you, and I want you to think of a situation when you wanted to intervene but didn't, that you're comfortable sharing with someone. And I want you to share that with your partner, and what did you do or what didn't you do and why, and how did you feel? Because as I said, we want this to be very personal because it's about our lives and what kept you from intervening. And then also, was there a time when you needed someone to intervene on your behalf and no one did? So just take a few minutes and talk to each other about a time you wanted to intervene but didn't, what happened, why, how you felt, why you didn't intervene, and then if there's a time you wish someone would have been your ally and intervened on your behalf. And it could be threes, not going to be rigid, but don't do like 4 because then you won't have enough time. And have fun talking to each other. If you can hear me, clap once. If you can hear me, clap twice. Okay, that's a good way to bring the attention back up front. So here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to hear some examples if anyone's willing to share. But there's one important rule, which is that you only share for yourself and not for your partner. It's their choice. You can say, I think it would be good for the group to hear that. Would you be willing to share that? But they could say no. So you only share for yourself. And also, sometimes we don't feel good saying these words that people said to us, like we don't want to give power to them. But we have to remember we're saying them now in order to do something when people say them in the future. So we need to know what we're dealing with. And when I said before about how I learned about oppressions that didn't affect me, that I used to not notice, it's because I heard the words, I heard the stories, I heard people's experiences, and that's the only way I could learn about something that doesn't happen to me. So I hope we could feel comfortable saying things that we wouldn't say for the purposes of why we're here. So does anyone want to share a comment or a situation that offended them when they were a bystander, personally? And I give great thanks to the person who raised their hand first, because then other people raise their hands. So would anyone be willing to share first? Thank you. Could you say actually the words?
He said, hey, you really look like that kid in Gran Torino.
What's Gran Torino? I don't watch.
It's a movie.
Okay, thank you.
And there was no similarity.
Okay. So I want to repeat it for the camera. So there's a situation in your workplace between two coworkers. And one person is a person of color, is that correct? One person is a person of color. And another person, a white person, says to them, you look like this person of color in the movies. But in reality, those who don't look like anything at all like each other.
Correct.
So what's going on here is your white coworker is objectifying or stereotyping or seeing this other coworker who you see in many other ways only by the basis of the color of their skin, which in fact in this case is very insignificantly related. Is that an accurate description?
Yes.
Okay, so then the question would be, what could you do in that situation? Right, that would be why we're here. And I'll just jump ahead of the PowerPoint because it's not good to be trapped in being linear, right? So what you could do is you could confront the person and say, I'm really offended by that remark. I don't think he looks anything like that person. And there's sometimes where you'd want to do that. But in this case, you might not want to because it's a workplace situation. You have to see, or if you have authority, you might say, we don't talk that way around here. We're going to have a talk later. So that's called confrontation. I find that confrontation is very effective, but it has very limited value in certain situations. And the other person has to care about you enough to care that you're upset, right? Some people don't care when we're upset. So confrontation is one skill that's very important, and it's what we think of when we talk about bystander intervention. Another one is what we call an indirect intervention, where you might just change the subject. You might say like, oh, did you see the Black Panther? Everyone's been going to that movie, and you just completely take the attention away from that comment, and you reboot the conversation down a different road. Now, that doesn't really address the problem, but it still changes the dynamic of the situation. Actually, another one that's even more low-key is you could just say, oh, I forgot I'm late for a meeting, and you just leave, because you're not going to stay in the situation. Or maybe you might say, oh, really, I don't see the similarity, like this one's tall and this one's short, right? Or you could say, let's say your colleague's name is Tom, your African-American colleague. You could say, well, what I like about Tom is, like, he's brilliant whenever I don't know how to write a report. You know, he knows all the research. So you can replace a negative, in this case it's not a negative comment, it's called an ignorant comment. You can replace a problematic comment with a positive comment about the group or individual that is being referred to. So I call that indirect intervention. Indirect intervention is very valuable because in these socially complicated situations, it gives us a chance to do something that interrupts the remark. Now, the other thing you could do is your colleague that made the remark, let's say I made the remark. You could approach me later and say, oh, Alan, I wanted to ask you something about what you said before, like about the character, like, why did you think they look the same? They look completely different to me, and you could have a conversation about it. And I would say, well, they're both really black, you know, whatever. And they're going to say, and you could say, yeah, well, that's true, but look at this difference, and look at this difference, and look at this difference. And then you could help me see what's wrong about my approach to the situation. You could point out all the other differences that I didn't recognize. Now, with people, certain people you don't want to do that with, who I call toxic. You know, there's certain people who don't want to have a conversation with you, or they don't want to hear what you have to say. But many people are willing to hear what you have to say after you've heard what they have to say. So if you give them a chance to help you understand what they said and why they said it, then you can give your feedback about that. So that's what we'll see that later. Those are the different skills that I propose we can use in these different situations. Do you want to make a comment? Like, would any of those be helpful to you?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that would be helpful.
Okay, because otherwise we can go home, right? If it's not. Okay, anyone else want to share an example? Thank you very much. And you know, sometimes in the moment you're like you don't know what to say because you can't believe the person is saying this. Okay, that was what happened. Like, what are you talking about? They don't look anything like each other. So what you realize is that you change your mindset and you realize this stuff is floating around everywhere. And now I have a chance to say something. As opposed to being shocked. Like, you know, now with the media, everyone except the victims are shocked. You know, everyone except the Me Too, which is so many women and other groups. People who didn't know are shocked. But once you get over your surprise, you see that it's everywhere. And then you almost could be delighted that when someone says something stupid, you're not delighted that they said something stupid. You're delighted that you have a chance to change the dynamic. So then that gap where you didn't know what to do until you went home, right? That gap really gets compressed. And then you also practice. So maybe in your case, you really didn't know what to say, and you go into a colleague's office and you say, you know, Alan made this really stupid remark and I didn't know what to say. Could we like play around with it a little bit and try out different things? So that's why you need to practice. So anyone else want to share a remark that made you uncomfortable? You were all talking, so what were you talking about? Thank you. So would you be willing to repeat the actual words? Because that's important.
I don't recall.
Okay, we'll make up something similar. You mean like monthly things?
That was part of it.
Okay.
And other health complications.
Okay, so this person is meeting with a supervisor, and the supervisor makes a very sexist comment about a female colleague who isn't smart enough to be promoted. So let me make up a remark that could fit your description. What if I was your supervisor and I had said, well, I don't think women make good leaders because once a month they're going to be completely irrational. Would that like be the type of remark?
So, yeah.
Okay. Because we want to know what we're talking about, right? Now, this situation is a little more complicated because it's your supervisor as opposed to your co-worker, right? So probably you're not going to use confrontation. I mean, you could, but you have to accept the consequences. But most of us are not going to say, I find that mark really offensive, and it's not my experience of women at all, right? So what are you going to do? So you could use an indirect comment. You could say, really, that's interesting. Some of my best supervisors have been women, right? So that right away, like, erases the assumption. Or, you know, if you happen to be living with a woman, you could say, well, my wife gives me great advice 30 days of the month. Right? That's why I said it kind of almost becomes fun because you can really be so creative with it. Once I'll tell you a little story. So I used to live in this little hamlet, and I could like go for a cup of coffee and then go to the post office, and then, you know, I could just do all my errands and walk around. So I was walking across the parking lot of the supermarket, and there were some teenagers sitting on the corner, and they were throwing trash on the ground. And I got really infuriated. That just like pushed some buttons inside of me. So I decided I needed to say something to them. So I walked across the parking lot, and that gave me a chance to like cool myself down while I was walking. So when I got there, I said, oh, would you like me to pick this up? And they're like, oh, no, that's okay. And then they all picked it up. So it's like there's so many everyday opportunities. But these are two good comparisons because one involves a power differential. Now, you also could use the third skill with your supervisor in another context, maybe that was more informal, and you could say, you know, Alan, I'm curious about that comment you made when I had my supervision meeting with you last week about that you don't trust women to make good decisions. Like, I'd like to understand more why you feel that way. And then you kind of draw me out and you get like what my data is. So maybe I'm your supervisor and I wasn't promoted. I lost a really important promotion, and I felt that someone got it who really shouldn't have got it, and I really kind of have a chip on my shoulder towards female supervisors. So you can empathize with me, and you can say, you know, I really understand how you feel, and I think that was really unfair, and I would be upset too. But in my opinion, that was only that one person. That's not all women. And then, like, you finish the conversation. So the point is you have a lot of choices. Yes? Well, the gravy might taste good, but I agree with you. So I would just add, the question was that to point out, it was a comment and an observation or a reflection, that I'm not trying to change that person. I'm trying to disrupt the flow of the event and reframe it so that it's clear that there are people in the room who didn't like this remark. I wouldn't maybe use the word normal, but that this remark bothered me. Now, it could be that I would intervene and I was the only one who was bothered. And I still have a right to say, you know, even if it doesn't bother anyone else, it bothers me, to disrupt the flow. But the other piece of the puzzle that we want to add is that we know that it also probably bothers most people, and they're also not saying anything. So you're not only breaking the flow and disrupting the event for the person who makes the problematic remark, you're re-educating the other bystanders who don't realize that you're upset. Go ahead.
So this.
Okay, great example. So just to cook it down, so there's another issue about whether or not we can effectively use humor in bystander scenarios. And in the case of the white person comparing two people of color who didn't look like each other at all, another white bystander could say, well, actually, we look really alike because, look, we're both white. So here's the question. First of all, it's complicated. And it might be really bad to use humor in some situations, and it might be perfect. So a definition of good communication was when intent equals impact. So if you make this humorous comment about your whiteness and he gets your point, then it was a great intervention. Right? If he walks away not having a clue that you weren't comfortable with his remark, then you didn't intervene. So humor can be very effective, and I use it myself. And it's just a question of learning to figure out what works in what situation. And sometimes humor can be more effective because it's like coming in from the side door unexpectedly. It depends.
Now the power differential is
In the reverse direction, now you have an employee making a sexist comment about a female's judgment to a supervisor. Well, so if it was in public, then if that remark was made in a public setting with other people, then I would choose to use confrontation, because if I don't confront the remark right away and say, Alan, you know, that's not true. And we have great, brilliant women who work here, so I don't know where you got that idea. You have to be careful because you don't want to humiliate the person. But you can't not address it in a public context, and you're undermining your own authority if you don't. But if it was in private, you have to decide, because maybe I'm having a performance evaluation with you and you have to give me bad news, right? You have to tell me that I'm not performing up to standards, or that you have to write a letter. So you don't want to like ruin, the main objective of the conversation is for you to tell me about my job performance, so you don't want to mess up the conversation by creating a distraction. So maybe then you let it go and you talk to me later about it. Or maybe you use an indirect intervention. Or maybe it's a perfect example of why we're having the supervisory meeting, and you say, right, and you say, you know, Alan, I don't know if you realize this, but you have a loose tongue. And a lot of times you say things without thinking that are offensive to people in our office, and this just offended me. So you see how you can't really prescribe it? That's why one of my main points is no one can tell you what to do. We just have to give you the tools, because each situation is so unique, each person is so unique, each dynamic of relationship is so unique. There isn't a right answer. The right answer is to do something that disrupts the flow, and that lets the other bystanders know, if there are bystanders, that, so for example, going back to your situation with the coworker, you could also go and talk to the other bystanders. And you could say, what do you think about that comment Alan made about so-and-so? And then you could have a conversation with them, because then what you're also doing is you're priming them to say something the next time. So you're using the scenario to educate the other bystanders and, let's say, raise their consciousness. So you have so many angles, but you can't tell someone what they have to do. I really feel that. But that's a good example where you flip it. But then when you're the supervisor responding to the employee's offensive remark, you have to consider all the variables and what's your priority in that moment. And that would also be determined by whether or not there's other people present. So someone else had a hand, but I forgot where. So give an example of differential behavior based on relative privilege.
So I work in a
A perfect example, thank you. So we're in deep waters very quickly. It's not even 9:30, but that's good. So let me explain the scenario. So the questioner is someone who identifies as a male who is white, and he's really done a lot of thinking about his identities and realized that those two identities give you a lot of benefits, which we call privilege. And sometimes people with dominant identities behave in condescending ways towards people with less prevalent or privileged identities, and that condescension can also be offensive and oppressive. Is that so far so good? Yep. Okay. So now what happens? That person with those identities, who could also be me, walks into a situation where something is happening that isn't okay, but he doesn't want to use his privilege. He doesn't want his privilege to shape his stepping in a way that makes the situation worse. And it's very important to acknowledge that, because very, very many well-meaning people think they're helping, quote unquote. And it's like, I don't want that help. or it's not changing anything. So I think it's very good for you in your position to recognize the complexities of your saying anything. And if you want to say something because you want to, which you don't personally, if someone in your identity wants to say something because they want to save someone, because they feel sorry for them, then that's problematic. But on the other hand, this is a great example, because if I want to ask the people who identify as female in the room. By the way, we call this benign sexism. You know, when you so I'm benign. I'm paternalistic and benignly sexist, and I'm at a bar and I see someone that's going to sexually assault you, and I want to step in and intervene, but I'm doing it for wrong motivations. Would you still rather have me intervene? I mean, it's more. It's like it's not so simple all the time. I'd rather prevent an actual sexual assault from happening and then maybe learn that I could have done it in a better way, or that I had certain problematic attitudes, than to not intervene at all. And I assume that most people who identify as female would also rather have me intervene that situation, even though they don't agree with my mindset. So going back to your situation, the question is, how do you intervene in the situation without reproducing your privilege in an unproductive way, rather than not intervene at all? That would be the question. So then you could intervene like in an indirect way, or make a comment that doesn't enhance your, quote, status that's artificially given to you by your gender, right, and your skin color. But what happens with, if you go to some college campuses where there's like a great, like on a 1 to 10 scale, their social justice awareness is 9.5, like all the men talk about privilege, and people never intervene because they get frozen. They're like, oh, I don't know what to do. I don't want anyone to think, you know, and then they don't act on their knowledge. So it's almost better for you, in someone like you, which is me, it's almost better for us to do something and not do it well than to not do something at all. Because if we don't do it well, we can ask people, well, what did you think of that? And what could I have done differently? And you could talk to maybe some people who don't share your identities, like a female or a person of color, or a female person of color, and say, you know, I really didn't know what to do when I was in this situation, and could you help me out? Because then they could tell you what it would be like from the other side. Yes, thank you.
I appreciate that comment, and I actually think we have a really good example of that.
Perfect, great. Okay, let's hear it. So they were going to have another example that relates back to this situation.
Well, yeah, it came up earlier in the humor discussion.
Okay.
So there was.
Or it could even be seen as like an affirmation of racial superiority.
Exactly. So that was a situation when I
Great.
as okay, maybe,
so
maybe that was an intervention
that maybe
would have been
perfect. Thank you. So,
however, sorry, one more thing.
okay, but then I have to repeat it. So.
Sure. Then I'll
I'm sorry to interrupt you. No, it's a perfect example where we have to be clear about our motivation. Because someone standing up in the lectern might want to like not let you talk so much. Whereas I think it's great what you're saying. So there's a reflection about the workplace example where an irrelevant comparison was made because two people were people of color, and another participant mentioned you could use humor and call attention to the fact that they were both white as a way of showing the absurdity of the comment. And the present comment is that might depend on how the person of color, who is the original target of the remark, felt about the comment, and it could have the opposite effect. Sorry.
It did was.
It deflected. That's called deflection. So another colleague, instead of reinforcing reinforcing the person of color as the object of attention, talked about their discomfort with the remark. Okay, so let me reflect on this whole thing. It's very complicated, and there's a lot that we don't know, right? Even at a tier 1, PhD granting research-based institution, there's a lot that we don't know, and we make a lot of mistakes. There's one, if you've ever done training with the National Coalition Building Institute, their diversity training, they have this exercise where you pair with someone who's not like you, and you say, I love making mistakes. And it's like, I hate that exercise. I don't like making mistakes. Are you kidding? And the person says, I welcome your mistakes about me and my group. And it's like, whoa, because even though I don't like making mistakes, I'm more easy on myself when I make a mistake, because we all make mistakes. So let's say all these three scenarios were one scenario. And we were all standing around and someone made the comment and you said something and then someone else responded with humor. And then later on you went to the person who's a humor and said that, that didn't really feel right to me because of this. Then if I was a person with humor, I would say, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I didn't realize. What could I have said instead? And that's how we all go forward together. We don't go forward together by smashing each other for making a mistake, unless you're a perpetrator of sexual assault, right? Then you're a danger to the community. But we go forward by becoming more conscious and aware of what we're talking about, and by learning from each other's experiences and finding the best response for the situation, considering all the variables. Because it's also possible that the person of color didn't mind and was really grateful. So that's why, let me jump ahead now, but the research shows that all the prominent bystander programs produce an effect that has what's called a rebound. That most bystander programs increase what we call bystander intentions, like I would like to do something, now I want to do something more. But the unfortunate thing is intentions don't always translate into actions. Why not? I believe because we're not having this kind of discussion where we're giving each other like 20 ways you could respond. So then you try something and it didn't work out well and then you don't want to do it again. But also, when it does result in bystander actions, they go away after a year. All the research shows us. It's called a rebound. So why doesn't it last when people care and want to do something? It doesn't last because we're not having this kind of discussion. Because maybe one time you used humor and you thought you blew it and you're afraid to use humor the next time, and the next time humor would be perfect. So you need this kind of process. You need a model where you teach people intervention skills and you have a chance to reflect on it and process it and discuss it and mentor it and reinforce it. It's an ongoing thing. It isn't just a workshop. I don't think the people who teach bystander intervention are naive enough to say it's a vaccination, once you get it you're fine. But the point is we're not doing all the other things we need to keep it going forward. So if we want to offer something like this, we need to also figure out how to do what we're doing now so that people have a thoughtful, reflective way of processing it and learn from the times it didn't work and then still want to do something and try something the next time. But for instance, the comment about yourself as a person of color experiencing this remark, if I made the response and you confronted me and were very angry, which would certainly be justified based on your experience of racism, that you might feel a little angry, right? That would be totally justified remark, but I would have to rise above I would have to really understand your reaction in order to want to do something the next time. So we just have to realize it's very complicated, and we accept how complicated it is, and we have enough brilliance in the room to work with how complicated it is, and we accept the fact that for the most part all of us are really well motivated and care and want to learn how to do the right thing, and that we're here to teach each other how to do it. And someone who's a danger to the community shouldn't be here, which is why we're here.
There's kind of like levels, or maybe, I don't know.
Absolutely. So once again, we're reminding ourselves how complicated this is. So let me just, so in this case, if you have an underrepresented group in a majority-dominated situation, such as women in science and technology, and that's a setup for sexism to show up, because the dominance of the male majority group makes it comfortable for them to say inappropriate things about the very few, it could be other groups, international students, whatever. So you're pointing out that if the women in science and technology respond with an indirect intervention, that might make the faculty in that department uncomfortable inviting them to social events that are an important part of their career development, so that speaking to the oppression ends up resulting in new oppression. Is that accurate?
That's right.
it's really because I have responsibility to repeat what each of you said correctly, right? So you can correct me. So that's true, but then the question is, do you not respond, or what do you do? What I would recommend in that situation is that probably a lot of other men in that situation are also bothered by the remark and are bystanders. So I would encourage you to figure out who your male allies are and talk to them and help them be more active in intervening on your behalf rather than letting you do all the heavy lifting. Because that's another way that the dynamic of oppressions work, is we let the group that's being mistreated do all the work, and then we just all say, oh, really great, I'm glad they're saying something finally. Wait a minute, what about you? Once when I worked at the military, I was talking to one of the first women who was on an aircraft carrier. So that's like a city. That's like 2,000 people. So she's one of the first female officers in this aircraft carrier. And after she was there a while, a lot of men started coming up to her and saying, I'm really glad you're here because the guys have really cleaned up their language since you're here. So it's like, why have you been putting up with this for all? You know, like you need a few women to show up to shut up the guys who are making the stupid remarks. Don't you have a mouth? So, you know, it's like every time you expose something, you have a new problem. But the fact that you expose something is good, and now you deal with the new problem. So, but you don't naively think, well, now everything's fine and everyone's going to love me because I'm like the only female in my department, right? You know that it's not going to go away, but that we're all making progress, which is a good metaphor for what we're doing here at this institution. Well, it's not, and it's also not clear the effect of your action, right? So it's simple because you could always do something. That's what I believe. Like really, if you go on my website, I have these little clips. I do things in the most absurd situations that I would never could have imagined myself do anything, but I could think of things to do. So it's simple, but it's complicated at the same time, but you don't let the fact that it's complicated jam you. You acknowledge the fact that it's complicated, and then you navigate the complexity. It's like you're in a labyrinth. Which way should I turn? Well, you ask someone who went a little further than you. In this case, someone who went a little further than me, and go back into the scenario about the skin color comparison. In this case, the person who went a little further than me is a person of color who experiences these remarks all the time. So now we create an environment where someone who fits that description is willing to share their experience with us. Now we know more if we don't have that identity. That's what we want. So it's just a process. You have to look at it as a process. And sometimes humor is great, and I use it myself. Sometimes it doesn't work. Nothing works all the time. So it's more about the process. That's why I'm really glad this discussion is happening. I don't care. You know, we'll get to the PowerPoint later, because we need to understand how it's a process, and we're all imperfect human beings who have been taught prejudices, and we're all going into the process, and we're going to put our foot in our mouth and make mistakes. But if we're well-intentioned and we don't want to make mistakes, then the process allows us to not do that in the future. Whereas, just to remember what we're talking about, the sexual predator will do it over and over and over again. So that person isn't someone who belongs in this process that we're talking about. But all of us as bystanders can inhibit that person by reflecting and talking about what's effective.
Work and they don't read and we don't
Right.
do
And one of my professors once gave me a quote from 1890. That was the exact quote about how students aren't the way they used to be.
The world is wrong.
Okay, so first of all, I have to repeat it, so bear with me. Human beings are social creatures, right? Like our nervous systems are designed for us to be social. So we interact in a social way, and that includes chit-chat and gossip, or what I was taught to call kvetching, which is a Yiddish word for complaining about other people. So we get together and we kvetch about each other. That's normal. I'm not saying that's a problem. The question is it productive? If there's, let's say, systematic oppression, and your department isn't hiring female faculty or female grad students or whatever, or your department is hiring students and then not giving them what they need to succeed here and then blaming them, then we should complain about it, right? But there's also non-productive complaining, which is called gossip. So I just think there's a fine line, and we have to be conscious of it, that how we talk about each other, that talking about each other and ourselves is important, and how we talk about each other and ourselves may reproduce injustices or may serve to alleviate them, which is the same dilemma of the white male who's aware of his privilege and doesn't want to reproduce his privilege, but still as a human being wants to do something. So I'm going to take one more comment and then go a little further in the PowerPoint. No? Okay, does that kind of address your question? But like I said, it's complicated, so we accept the complication and we go forward, but we fight injustice. And we reduce sexual harassment and sexual assault because we're willing to do something and before we weren't. And even if it's clumsy and it doesn't really work well, the process allows us to keep going and refine our abilities as opposed to stopping after 1 year. Because the research is very robust about that. I was reading on the airplane zillions of studies that I didn't have time to read. All the bystander programs increase intent to intervene, and some of them increase intervening, and it's all gone after 1 year. So pick whichever one you want. In the end, after 1 year, you won't have anything. That might be too strong, but I do that sometimes. Of course, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the insights that was mentioned yesterday, is it's not only intervening in the most extreme situation, it's intervening in any situation that's uncomfortable, including when someone else tells you a story. Right? Like, go back to the first scenario about the skin color comparison. Now maybe one of your colleagues thought it was really funny and is telling you, and you don't like it, so now you're the bystander. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And by the way, the dilemma of the straight white male intervening for ambiguous motivations is a subject of a lot of research now. And a lot of researchers are showing that men who get involved in anti-sexist, anti-violence work sometimes have paternalistic or like white knight on white horse motivations. But we're not going to, my attitude is I'm not going to throw them out. I'm going to lead them to the next step. It's a process. If you read the literature, there's stages of the development of being an ally. You don't say, well, because you still have things that need to be fixed, you have to leave the room. You say, it's great that you're here, and it's great why you're here, but you're an imperfect human being, so did you notice that you're being a little condescending right now towards me? Okay, so let's go forward. So these are the 3 popular bystander programs that you can bring to your campus. And I was pointing out that there's a lot of research in support of them, but they don't include the social norms approach, which is norms correction, which I feel is a flaw, because the research shows that norms correction disinhibits bystanders, and that, in my opinion, you're better off designing your own, and they've all been shown to rebound, etc. A lot of times what happens is something gets developed that is science-based and supported by research and evaluation, and then 5 years later there's new knowledge and it doesn't get integrated into the previously successful thing, so then you still have it doing good things but not doing as good things as if it incorporated the new knowledge. So we can be a bystander to an individual, to a group, or to a system or an institution. Because we have to remember, we're not saying that sexual harassment would go away if we all started intervening all the time, because we'd still have pay differentials, we still have all these other system things. So we also become bystanders to a system. But we're saying if we intervene more often, it could be really worthwhile, it could do a lot of good. So we notice the event, interpret it as a problem, feel responsible for dealing with it. Probably everyone who's here today is already in that stage 3, and then have the skills to act. That's what the research shows. So the racism that I notice, I try and say something, and the racism I don't notice, I don't even know that I'm a bystander. But then if I notice more, I do more. So we want to move the whole community, and I think the United States, it's really not fair to say that for the most part, men in the United States are waking up to the reality of sexual harassment for women in the United States because now it's in the media. So we're talking about a lot of things that could be a bystander scenario, right? You need to understand all these things are situations in which you could intervene. And these events differ for different communities, so we're talking in women in science and technology, or the only person of color in a workplace, or whatever it is, the only person whose English isn't their native language. We have all these different scenarios, and we have all these different contexts in a big institution like this, and we have employers making offensive remarks to employees, and so we have all these things. We have to tailor the bystander intervention and the social norms interventions to the context that is very different across a big institution like this. And we can't just give a generic training. So the idea is to get a group of people like you who are really committed to this and aware of all the issues, and then go back to your workplace and say, what are the bystander scenarios here? What are the appropriate skills here? What are the bystander skills that incoming graduate students from other countries need? You know, and what are the bystander skills that new faculty need, or new faculty of certain identities that are more marginalized here? And then we start really working through, you know, that we differentiate it so that we apply it appropriately in all the different communities, which is what best practice is for prevention. It has to be tailored and relevant to the community. So why don't people intervene? It's very important that we not give ourselves a hard time for not intervening. It's like give yourself just enough hard time to do something the next time. But you have a lot of people who get paralyzed by guilt. Like, I'm a white straight male, so I could feel really guilty about a lot of things and feel really bad about all the things white straight men do, and I could just not even get out of bed in the morning. But then I'm not doing something when it's right in front of me. You know, I could talk about oppression from the point of view of being Jewish, right? So we're all very complicated. I'm named after someone who perished in the Holocaust. So when someone says the Holocaust doesn't exist, like I could feel it right now inside of me. So it's very complicated, but we need to realize that there's obvious, simple reasons why we don't intervene. And if we understand those, we could overcome them, not beat ourselves up. So one is, you don't see anyone else doing anything, so you think, well, maybe it's not a problem. No one else is doing anything. You're afraid of embarrassing yourself or the other people. That's legitimate. You don't want to embarrass your colleague in front of your other colleagues. You don't want to embarrass yourself. You assume that someone else will do something. That's called diffusion of responsibility. That's why, like, if you take Red Cross crisis intervention training, they teach you don't say, would someone call 911? You say, raise your hand if you have a cell phone. You call 911. No diffusion of responsibility. Otherwise, everyone's waiting because they thought that someone else must have called 911. Then there's the social norms piece, which is, I don't think that it upsets you, as opposed to, I don't see you doing anything. I don't think it upsets you. So all these things, and then there's fear of retaliation. Like when your supervisor makes, you know, a time of the month offensive remark about females, that could have, your response could affect your paycheck. Or whether or not you get invited to social events in your department, which might be important for your career advancement, right? So it's all very real. And with all this together, what happens is the research shows that when you have more people, people do less. So if you have one person and you need help, you get more help than if there's two. If there's two people, and it's like, I'm selfish. I want more help from more people. Why do I get less help from more people? Because all these things are flying through people's heads, right? If it was a cartoon, you think, no one else seems upset. Well, I don't want to upset anyone. Well, I don't want to get in trouble, blah, 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 blah. And then there you're standing there. So that's called the bystander effect. The good news is that when you have a community in which people have shared norms for intervening, the presence of other people empowers people to act. So that's what we want. in all of our campuses. We want to know that other people will support us to say or do something, and that we can do it in a way that doesn't incur. That's why that's why giving a range of skills is important. That's why indirect intervention can be very important, because you're not trying to embarrass someone, you're not trying to make them feel bad, you're not trying to jeopardize your relationship with them, but you're still doing something. So the bystander effect could be reversed, but we need to understand why the bystander effect exists. And it's for really, let's say, human natural reasons. But it's based on misinformation. Is that clear to everyone? That all these reasons are assumptions. So the universe is threatened by us having this discussion. So does that make sense, that all these reasons are assumptions that may or may not be true? Now, if I have a legitimate fear of retaliation, I should intervene in a different way. Unless I don't mind, like, civil disobedience. People go to jail because they care about something and they're willing to accept the consequences. But then I'm not afraid. Well, I might not like it, but I'm not afraid of it. I did that once. When I was in college, I was arrested in a national stop the draft. But that's not relevant to the talk. Just triggered a memory. Okay. Actually, I think this is a good place to stop. So let's do this first. By the way, that was a really good discussion, and I'm happy to not stay with the PowerPoint. Because if it's alive and it's in the moment, then we have to go with the flow, go with the energy, and then we'll just go through the other stuff quickly later. And by the way, just as a reflection, when I'm training young men to facilitate rape prevention workshops and talk about these issues with other young men, part of the training is to not strictly follow a script, but when a conversation comes up that has a lot of energy, to go into the conversation and work through. So someone says there's a lot of false accusations, and then you have a conversation. Well, did you know the research is that they're very rare? Does anyone know anyone in the room who was sexually assaulted? Do you believe that person? So you use the opportunity of the moment. And then in the end, you go through the manual really quickly. The only problem with this style that I have is when someone gets a grant from CDC and they want to do a reproducible scientific experiment, and then you can't flow all over the place, right? You have to find some compromise between flexibility and having a structure. But in general, it's important when we're educating about these really intense issues that have emotions associated with them, that we make room for it and we take advantage of the opportunity and not be afraid to not cover a point or something. So here's what we're going to do before the break. It was a continuation of what we just did, which is at the end we're going to do more practice, and I'm going to do more modeling of role plays and of ways of intervening. So I'd like you to write an offensive remark that you heard in one of your roles on this campus that you would like to see a role play, how you could respond to that. And obviously we're not going to do all of them, although all of you could do yours when we do the practice. And obviously you shouldn't write something that you might not want me to say in front of the group. But we want to get examples, because the examples also make it very real, right? Like now, in your situation, if it ever happens again, you also consider how the person of color might interpret your remark, and not only if you sent the message to the person who made the remark, we need to have the actual examples in order to figure out how to deal with the actual situation. So everyone write a remark that you'd like to see, and then leave it at the table with the camera in the back as we go for the break, and we'll take a 10-minute break, and then we'll see how far we get in the PowerPoint before we have our next great discussion.